Helen Carter had lived in the same neighborhood for over 50 years. She had seen it change, watched it shift from a tight-knit black community to a gentrified space where the faces were unfamiliar and the gazes were colder. At 74, she still walked to the grocery store herself, refusing to let age or aching knees dictate her independence. That day was no different. The afternoon sun was hot against her back as she stepped out of Carter's Market, a small grocery store that had been there longer than most of the new coffee shops and yoga studios popping up in the area. In her right hand, she carried a plastic bag, just a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a few canned goods. Nothing unusual. But the weight of the bag wasn't what made her uneasy. It was the weight of the eyes on her. Across the street, a black and white patrol car sat idling, 2 officers inside. Helen had noticed them the moment she left the store. They weren't just parked, they were watching. She kept walking. She had learned long ago not to react. Reacting gave them something to work with, so she kept her pace steady, her spine straight, her face unreadable. The sound of tires crunching against the pavement made her stomach tighten. A single, sharp chirp of a siren. Helen exhaled slowly, but didn't stop until the squad car pulled up beside her. The passenger window rolled down and a white officer, mid-30s, clean-shaven, with the kind of practiced, almost casual authority that came from knowing he could do whatever he wanted, leaned out. "Mom, can you stop for a second?" Helen turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with patience, not submission. "Something wrong, officer?" The driver, a larger man with a shaved head and thick arms, stepped out of the car. His presence alone made it clear he was the enforcer, the kind of man who didn't ask twice. "You live around here?" the first officer asked. Helen's lips pressed together. She knew this game. "I do," she answered evenly. "Been living here longer than you've been alive." The driver let out a chuckle, stepping closer. "That's so." His eyes raked over her, assessing, looking for something. An excuse, a crack in the armor. "Got some ID on you?" Helen sighed. "Why do I need to show you my ID?" "Just a routine check," the first officer said smoothly, as if that explained everything. Routine. Helen knew better. Helen Carter had been in this situation before. Different faces, different uniforms, but the same game. She knew how it worked, how they tested people, how they pushed just enough to see if they'd get compliance or resistance. She wasn't going to give them either. Officer Barnes leaned against the car door, his fingers drumming lazily against the frame, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. "Ma'am, it's just a routine stop," he repeated, as if saying it again would make it true. Helen didn't move. "A routine stop for what?" Barnes glanced at his partner, Officer Reynolds, who smirked and stepped closer. He was the muscle in this dynamic. Bigger, bulkier, the kind of cop who enjoyed making people feel small. "We had some reports of suspicious activity in the area," Reynolds said. His voice smooth, rehearsed. Helen lifted an eyebrow. "And an old woman carrying groceries fit the description?" Reynolds' smirk didn't fade. "We just need to confirm a few things. Now let's not make this difficult." Helen sighed and reached into her coat pocket, moving slowly, not because she was scared, but because she knew how quickly situations like this could turn deadly. She pulled out her wallet and handed Barnes her ID. He took it, flipping it over as if expecting to find something hidden in the fine print. Helen Carter, 74 years old. He dragged out the words, as if they were somehow suspicious. Reynolds crossed his arms. "What's a lady like you doing out here this late?" Helen exhaled through her nose, keeping her voice steady. "I went to the store. I do it every week. Is there a law against that now?" Barnes turned to his partner. "Run it." Reynolds took the ID and moved back to the car, calling it in over the radio. Helen stood there, her fingers tightening around the handle of her grocery bag. She could hear the faint static from the radio, the dispatcher responding, but she already knew what they'd find. Nothing. Because she wasn't a criminal. But that wasn't the point of this. The point was to remind her that they could stop her, that they could make her stand here on the side of the road like a suspect, like someone who didn't belong. She'd seen it happen before. She'd seen it end badly. Barnes took a step closer. "Where'd you say you lived again?" Helen met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I didn't." Barnes let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You got a smart mouth, don't you?" Helen didn't respond. She just waited, because the real game hadn't even started yet. Helen Carter had patience, but not for foolishness. She knew how this would play out. They weren't looking for a crime. They were looking for control. Officer Barnes still held her ID, tapping it against his palm as if debating his next move. Officer Reynolds leaned against the squad car, watching her like a predator sizing up its prey. The radio crackled. "Carter is clear, no warrants, no priors." Barnes exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening slightly on her ID before flicking his gaze back to her. "Well, look at that. Clean record." Helen reached out her hand. "I could have told you that." But Barnes didn't give it back. Not yet. Instead, he studied her face, then smirked. "So, Helen, you live alone?" Helen's fingers curled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "No." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Got family nearby?" She could feel the game shifting. They weren't just asserting authority now. They were testing her, pushing to see if she'd crack. Helen tilted her chin slightly. "I have a son." Barnes hummed, pretending to be interested. "Oh yeah, what does he do?" Helen met his gaze directly. "Military." Reynolds scoffed. "Military, huh? Lot of guys say that." "What branch?" Helen let a small, knowing smile play at the corner of her lips. "Army." Barnes chuckled, shaking his head. "Army boy, haha, let me guess. Works a desk job somewhere." Helen held her ground. "Delta Force." Silence. Reynolds' smirk faltered just slightly, but Barnes covered it with a laugh. "Delta Force? Come on, lady. You expect me to believe that?" Helen didn't flinch. She had no reason to convince them. But she saw that moment of hesitation, that flicker of doubt. They didn't know if she was lying, and that uncertainty was enough. Barnes let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Well, now I'm curious." He tossed her ID to Reynolds. "Run the name. Let's see what we find." Reynolds hesitated, just for a second. Helen caught it, because even he wasn't sure if he wanted to poke that bear. Officer Reynolds hesitated for just a second, but that was all Helen needed to see. That flicker of doubt, that moment where confidence wavered, it told her everything. Still, he turned, walking back toward the squad car, calling in her son's name over the radio. Helen didn't move, her face unreadable, but inside she felt something shift. They had just made a mistake. Barnes, however, was still cocky. He studied her, tilting his head like he was trying to read something between the lines. "You serious, huh?" He let out a low chuckle. "So, what, you think your son's got some kind of pull? You think dropping a fancy title means something?" Helen exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I think you should hope he never finds out about this." Barnes grinned. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Helen held his gaze. "Because men like you have no idea what men like him are capable of." Barnes' smirk faltered just slightly, but before he could respond, Reynolds came back, his face noticeably stiffer. He didn't say anything at first, just handed Barnes the ID. Barnes frowned. "What?" Reynolds didn't look at him. Instead, he kept his eyes on Helen. "She's clear," he said quickly. "No need to push it." Barnes' jaw clenched. He didn't like being told to back off, especially not when they had already gone this far. "You checked the son?" Reynolds hesitated again, and Helen caught it. He had checked, and whatever he found made him nervous. Barnes scoffed. Jesus, Reynolds, what, did they tell you to drop it? Reynolds still didn't answer. That was enough. Helen reached for her ID, and this time Barnes didn't stop her. His fingers twitched slightly as he handed it over, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Well, sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am," he said, but there was no real apology in his voice. Helen took her ID, slipping it back into her wallet. She looked at them both. Two men who thought they owned the world just minutes ago, now suddenly unsure of the ground beneath their feet. She turned without another word, walking away. Behind her, Barnes muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Delta Force," he scoffed, "like I'm supposed to be scared of that." Reynolds said nothing, because deep down, he already was. Miles away, in a military base far removed from the city streets, Marcus Carter sat at the edge of his bunk, rolling the tension out of his shoulders after an intense training session. The weight of the day still lingered in his muscles, but his mind was clear, until his phone buzzed on the metal nightstand beside him. He glanced at the screen. "Mum?" Marcus rarely got calls from his mother at this hour. A faint crease formed between his brows as he swiped to answer. "Hey, Ma." Helen's voice was calm, too calm. "Hey, baby, you busy?" Marcus sat up straighter. Something was off. His mother never called just to chat if something was bothering her, but he had been raised to read between the lines. "No, I'm good," he said. "What's up?" Helen hesitated for just a moment. Then she exhaled. "Ran into a couple of officers today." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "What happened?" Her voice remained steady, but he knew her too well. "They stopped me. Asked questions. You know how it is." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Did they touch you?" "No, baby," she said quickly, "but they tried me. They tried to make me feel small." His breath came slower, deeper. That was worse in some ways. "Names," he said, his voice low. Helen sighed. "Marcus." "Name?" She paused. "Barnes and Reynolds." Marcus stood up, his entire demeanor shifting. Helen must have heard it because her voice softened. "I handled it," but Marcus wasn't hearing that. He was already moving, grabbing his keys, slipping into his boots. "Ma, I'll call you back." Helen sighed again. She had raised a man of discipline, but she had also raised a man who would not let disrespect go unanswered. And she knew deep down that tonight, this wasn't over. The police station was quiet when Marcus Carter pulled into the lot. He moved with a calm precision, his boots hitting the pavement with measured force. No wasted energy, no hesitation. Inside, Officer Barnes leaned against the front desk, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, scrolling mindlessly. Across the room, Officer Reynolds sat at a desk, feet kicked up, looking just as relaxed. The moment Marcus stepped through the door, the air shifted. He wasn't in uniform, wasn't carrying a weapon, but his presence alone was enough to make both officers straighten just slightly, an instinctual reaction they didn't fully understand yet. Barnes was the first to speak. "Can we help you?" Marcus didn't blink. "You stopped my mother today." Silence. Reynolds slowly lowered his feet to the floor. "Who's your mother?" "Helen Carter." The name landed heavy. Barnes glanced at Reynolds, then scoffed, shaking his head. "Look, ma'am, we were just—" Marcus took a step closer. Not aggressive, not loud, but the shift was undeniable. The room felt smaller. Barnes hesitated, looking Marcus over, trying to gauge what he was dealing with. "All right, listen. You know what Delta Force is." Marcus cut him off. His voice was even, controlled. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Yeah, we know." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then you know what we do." Neither officer answered. Marcus continued, voice low, precise. "I've spent the last 15 years handling problems before they become threats. People stronger, faster, better armed than you." Barnes' jaw tightened. "Look, man." Marcus stepped in just slightly. "You ever stop her again, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you so much as make her feel like she doesn't belong in her own neighborhood." He let the sentence hang, the unspoken weight pressing down harder than any raised fist ever could. Barnes swallowed. "Is that a threat?" Marcus tilted his head just a fraction. "No, it's a promise." Reynolds shifted, looking at Barnes, suddenly less sure of himself. Marcus held their gaze for a beat longer, then straightened. "Have a good night, officers." And with that, he walked out. Neither of them moved for a long moment, because for the first time they understood this was a fight they didn't want. Officer Barnes sat in the precinct's break room, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Across from him, Officer Reynolds hadn't spoken in minutes. The tension was thick, pressing against them like a weight neither of them knew how to lift. They had been through foot chases, violent arrests, and even a couple of shootouts, but this was different. The door to the captain's office swung open, and Captain Wilkes stepped out, his face tight with barely contained frustration. "Barnes, Reynolds, in my office, now." The two officers exchanged a glance before standing and following him in. Wilkes shut the door and leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Do either of you have any idea what kind of hellstorm you just kicked up?" Barnes shifted. "Captain, we—" Wilkes held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it." His jaw clenched. "I just got a call from people way above my pay grade. Military brass, even a senator." His gaze darkened. They all had the same question. Why the hell are two of my officers harassing Marcus Carter's mother? Reynolds exhaled sharply, but Barnes wasn't ready to back down. "Sir, we didn't know." Wilkes slammed a hand on his desk. "That's the damn problem. You didn't know. And now you've got the kind of attention this department does not want." The room went silent. Wilkes straightened, his voice lower now. "You're going to go to that woman's house. You're going to apologize. And you're going to pray that Carter doesn't decide to follow up on this." Neither of them argued, because they knew. That evening, Helen Carter stood at her front door, arms crossed, watching as Barnes and Reynolds shifted uncomfortably on her porch. Barnes cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we just wanted to apologize." Helen didn't respond. She simply waited. Reynolds swallowed hard. "We were out of line. It won't happen again." Helen studied them for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Good." She didn't invite them in, just soften, just watched them. They took the hint. As they walked back to their cruiser, Reynolds let out a slow breath. "We really messed up." Barnes didn't answer, because for the first time he knew it too. Inside, Helen sat at her kitchen table as Marcus stirred a cup of coffee across from her. She eyed him. "What did you do?" Marcus sipped his coffee, then smirked. "We had a conversation." And just like that, the storm had passed. But one thing was certain. It would never happen again. This story isn't just about a routine police stop. It's about power, respect, and consequences. Helen Carter faced a situation that too many people know all too well, being questioned simply for existing in her own neighborhood. The officers thought they had all the power, but they underestimated one thing: who she was connected to. Marcus Carter didn't need to raise his voice or his fists. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. About making sure that people in positions of authority understand that they can't misuse their power without facing consequences. So, what do you think? Did Marcus handle the situation the right way? What would you have done in his place? Do you think the officers truly learned their lesson? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.